Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
First of all, I just want to give a huge thank you to the organizers for creating this event, and to all of you for showing up to hear this discussion on a Friday night. So what we want to be talking about today is the question sort of what makes us human. And when we think about a human being, there's this sense we have when we think about a human being, that a human being seems to be something really unique, something special, something almost mysterious. So I think there's this sense we often have when we think about human beings that there's something about human beings that could never be captured in the notion of, say, just a bunch of molecules, or the notions that we see, for example, coming out of neuroscience or cognitive science. We have a sense that there's something mysterious about human beings, something that's going to go beyond any possible kind of description that would be merely scientific in character. And I think one really helpful way of capturing this intuition we have, this intuition that human beings in some way are mysterious, that they go beyond this kind of merely scientific knowledge, is by comparing a human being to a robot. So if we think about a robot, we can imagine that as technology improves, robots are going to get better and better at performing some of the kind of behaviors that we see human beings performing all the time. But although that's true, although we could imagine a robot performing a lot of the kind of behaviors that we think of now as being distinctively human, I think there's a sense a lot of us have that no matter how good a robot got at performing those behaviors, there'd be some special spark, some kind of special mysterious human quality that the robot could never achieve. So that there's something about humans that's going to forever elude this kind of work within robotics, some special quality we have, a kind of unique, mysterious quality you could never achieve in something that's a mere machine. And the question now arises, what are we going to do with this intuition we have? So we have this feeling that human beings have this special quality, and how should we think about that feeling now as we begin to think seriously about this topic of what human beings are really like? Should we think that this quality is on the right track, or should we think that it's wrong? So within my own discipline, the discipline of philosophy, there have been maybe two main views about what we should think about this kind of question. So one view says, maybe this intuition we have, this intuition that there's really something special, unique, mysterious about human beings, maybe this intuition is something that's deeply right. Maybe it's leading us on a really important track. And we should develop a philosophical system, a larger picture of the universe that kind of takes account of this intuition and vindicates it. A larger philosophical picture that's going to tell us what really is so special and so mysterious and so unique about human beings. But there's also another kind of view that some philosophers have about this, and this is a view that you see especially in this new field, the field of experimental philosophy. So this other kind of view that people have is that maybe when we find ourselves having this intuition of human uniqueness, of human specialness or the mysteriousness, the idea that there's some special spark that scientists could never capture, what we should do maybe is turn our gaze inward and try to understand a certain fact about ourselves. What we should try to understand about ourselves is why exactly is it that we have that intuition? What is it about our own minds that makes us think about human beings in this way? So when we engage in this kind of inquiry, this inquiry within experimental philosophy, you can think of our inquiry as having sort of three main levels. At the first level, we just want to understand what intuitions do people ordinarily have? What do people ordinarily think about this question? How do people ordinarily understand it? But then we're not going to just stop there. We're going to pursue this inquiry at a kind of deeper level and ask something further. We're going to ask, what are the underlying cognitive processes, the sort of psychological processes within our own mind that give rise to that intuition? What is it within our minds that makes us have the intuitions that we do? But then even that is not going to be something we're going to be content with. We also want to ask a subsequent question, a really philosophical question. And this question is, once we understand what those processes are, once we understand what's going on in our minds that makes us have the intuitions we do, we can ask, should we trust that? Is that something that we should put our faith in? Once we understand what that process is it one that we should believe in, or is it one that we should just dismiss and try to brush aside? So if you look at inquiries within experimental philosophy, I think what you find in general is that there's a gradual decrease in consensus and in confidence as you go down to these levels. So when we do experiments about people's intuitions, we usually come up with a pretty good consensus about what people's intuitions are. Different people working in this field will mostly agree with each other, and the people making claims about this will be pretty sure that they're on the right track. Once they go to this slightly deeper question, the question about the underlying cognitive processes, there starts to be some level of disagreement. Some people are saying opposite things about the very same topic. It becomes really hard to know whether we're right. And we go to this deepest level, the kind of philosophical question about warrant and justification. Then we see even more disagreement, and each researcher becomes even less confident that he or she is on the right track. So hopefully what you'll see as my introductory remarks continue is the gradual decline in my own confidence as we move through these steps. So I'm first going to say some things that are probably going to turn out to be right. Then I'm going to try my best to say things about a deeper level. That maybe those things will turn out to be wrong as further research proceeds. And then I'm going to try my best to say something about this deeper philosophical question. But there I'm just very uncertain, and I'm just going to be doing the best that I can to provide some answer to that question. So let's begin now with the most superficial question. So the question is just, what do people actually think about human uniqueness? What do people think is so special about humans? What do people think humans have that, for example, a robot can't? So just to give you a sense about how work on this kind of question is proceeding, I'll talk about one experiment that was done by the philosopher Bryce Huebner. So Huebner conducted an experiment in which participants were randomly assigned to one of two conditions. In one condition, they just learned about an ordinary person, and they were asked some questions about what kinds of properties and mental states this person might have. In the other condition, they were told about a robot, and they were asked some questions about this robot and what kind of mental states it might have. But they were told that the robot could perform exactly the same behaviors that the human could. So in other words, we have like Bob and Robo-Bob. Robo-Bob does all the very same things that Bob does, but unlike Bob, it's not a human being, it's just a robot. And now, Huebner drew on this kind of distinction that's played a tremendous role in philosophy and in cognitive science. This is a distinction between what we might call agency and experience. So just to give you a sense of these two different kinds of states, agency-related states and experience-related states, I'll just give a few examples of each. So the kind of states that would show agency are states like knowing something, believing something, intending something, deciding something. To the extent that you have states like these, you can be called an agent. The kind of states that would show experience are states like feeling pain, experiencing happiness, feeling fear, experiencing love. To the extent that you have states like those, you can be considered an experiencer. So what is the key difference between these states? The key difference is that the states on the right, the states that involve experience, are states that involve actually feeling something, actually having a special feeling. States that involve, for example, a quality that there's something that it's like to be in those states. By contrast, the states on the left don't necessarily have that quality. When you came into this room, you knew various things. You knew, for example, certain facts about mathematics, but maybe there wasn't any special feeling you had that was associated with that knowledge. It's for that reason that these states don't require experience. So I'm not going to discuss in real detail the experimental design that Huebner used, but suffice it to say that he asked questions about the human and questions about the robot, and for each of them, he asked about whether it could have those kinds of states that I was saying are associated with agency, and also whether it could have those kinds of states associated with experience. If you now look at agency, what you find is no significant difference between the two. In other words, people think human beings can know things, but they also think robots can know things. Human beings can plan to do things, and they also think robots can plan to do things. Whatever quality is that you have that allows you to do these things, people think a robot can have that quality too. By contrast, when we look at experience, what we find is a significant difference. Even though the robot could act exactly like a human being who is happy, the robot can't truly be happy. Even though the robot can act exactly like a human being who feels pain, the robot can't truly feel pain. There's something special about you as a human being, according to this study, that makes people think you are capable of truly feeling something in a way that a robot never ever could. So here I've talked about just one study, but a whole bunch of other studies have been run by other experimental philosophers and psychologists, all pointing to this same conclusion. It seems like people think there's something unique about human beings, and what's unique about human beings is not their capacity for agency, it's their capacity for experience. Human beings can have experience in a way that no robot ever could. So let's turn now to this deeper question. We've seen that people think human beings have this particular special quality, this capability of experience that isn't shared by mere machines. But why? What is it about human beings that people are latching onto that makes them think human beings have this special quality? Of all the things about you, what is it that people are thinking about you that makes them think you have this magical quality, the ability for experience, that no robot ever could? So here, you might consider a number of hypotheses. So one obvious hypothesis would be, people think that you were created by God, whereas a robot was just created by an engineer. Maybe that's the difference between you and the robot. Or you might think the difference is you have a brain, whereas this robot just has a bunch of chips in its head. Maybe that's the key difference between the two of you. Or you might think you have this really complex functional architecture, this really sophisticated, complex psychology that the robot could never have. Maybe that's the difference between the two of you. Now, if you consider each of these three hypotheses, I think what you'd see is that these are things that philosophers would think we should take really seriously. All three of these are things that philosophers would think, in a very serious way, we should consider as reasons that maybe human beings really do have a special quality that none of these other entities have. So these, I think, would all be considered to be plausible reasons for thinking that human beings really are unique. But the hypothesis we had was that the real reason people think you have this special quality isn't because of any of these things. It's because of something much more superficial. In particular, it's just because of how you look. So the hypothesis is the reason people think you have this special quality, this capacity for experience, isn't because of those deep things that we just mentioned. It's because of a fact about how human beings look. And the fact about how human beings look is that they have this immediate appearance of biology, that they have skin, they have flesh, and their flesh has this kind of immediate appearance, this visible appearance of looking biological, of looking like you have human biological embodiment. It's that quality, we're going to argue, that actually explains the sense we have that human beings are special, not the kind of philosophically respectable things we were considering earlier. So we conducted a whole bunch of different experiments to test this hypothesis, and I'm just going to give you as an example one. So in this experiment, we worked together as a collaborative team with the following people: Kurt Gray, who was the lead author on the study; Paul Bloom, who some of you might know, he's a professor in the psychology department here at Yale; Mark Sheskin; and Lisa Feldman-Barrett. The thing we tried to do was to just manipulate the degree to which people saw as salient the embodiment of an actual human being. So in all cases, participants are seeing a human being, and in some cases, we just make it more salient that this human being is embodied, that the human being has skin, and in other cases, we make the skin of the human being less salient. So we're decreasing the salience of the special quality humans have that, for example, robots lack. So in order to manipulate the salience of the body, participants in this experiment all received pictures. So they received pictures of people that they were supposed to be judging, and the pictures just differed in the salience of the body. So participants in the low body salience condition saw pictures that looked like these, and participants in the high body salience condition saw pictures that looked like these. Other than that, there's no difference. So the only difference between conditions is just, in one case you're getting this picture, in the other case you're getting that picture, and now looking at these pictures, you just have to make a guess about what these people are like. So in particular, you have to guess the degree to which they have certain capacities that are sort of characteristic of agency, and also certain characteristics that are kind of characteristic of experience. Of course, in presenting these questions to you, I'm grouping them under these categories, but when the real participants receive these questions, they just receive the questions all jumbled up in a random order and weren't aware that they fell neatly into these different categories. So people are just having to guess, based on this picture, how much do you think this person is capable of self-control? How much do you think this person is capable of experiencing hunger? And so on. So we can now ask, for each of the two groups, to what degree it has each of these qualities. And for agency, what we find is this. People who are seen as more embodied are seen as less capable of self-control, less capable of acting morally, less capable of kind of higher thinking. And we see this again and again when we run studies like this. The more people see you in terms of your body, the more your body is made salient to people, the less they're going to be seeing you as capable of these kinds of states, the agentic states. By contrast, though, for the experiential states, we find the opposite pattern. The more people are aware of you as being embodied, the more they're seeing you as capable of having these states. So notice what's happening here. There are certain kinds of states you have that are seen as special. They're states that you, as human beings, can have, but that people think no robot could ever have. And the question now is, how do people decide the degree to which you have those states? And what we're seeing as an answer is, the more skin you show, the more people think you're capable of having those kinds of states. So with that thought in mind, let's now return to the kind of original effect that we saw in the study by Hubner. So that original effect went like this. We said that if you look at an ordinary human being, and now you look at a robot, what you find is this special fact that people think even if the robot acts exactly like the human being does, the robot might be capable of these agentic states, but it's always going to be incapable of this further thing. It's always going to be incapable of having that uniquely human spark, the capacity to have experience. But why is that? Why is the robot seen as being incapable of doing that? So one hypothesis you might have is that it has to do with these really deep truths about facts that we know about the nature of robots, facts that we know about the nature of human beings. Maybe we're tapping into these deep truths, and that's why we think human beings aren't capable of doing these things, that human beings are capable of doing these things robots never could. Another possibility you might think of, though, is that robots just look different. If you look at a robot, it just looks very metallic. If you look at a human being, a human being has flesh, has skin. A human being has these superficial cues that trigger in you this immediate intuition, this immediate kind of feeling, that thing must have these special psychological states. So Huebner conducted then an additional psychological test to decide whether that hypothesis was right, to decide whether this hypothesis about the really superficial cues might be telling us something deep about why we think human beings are special. The test worked like this. Suppose that we control for all these deeper truths about the difference between human beings and robots, and we vary just that fact about superficial appearance. So in particular, suppose we say that both of these things are robots. Deep inside, both of them just have a bunch of computer chips, CPU, they're both just created by engineers. The only difference is that in one condition, we tell people that the robot looks like this, look kind of metallic. In the other condition, we say that the robot happens to look like this. So this thing, though a robot, has all of those superficial cues that will trigger in you this certain kind of immediate reaction. The reaction that you see whenever you see something that's going to have a sort of flesh, eyes, a face. And what Huebner found was a significant effect such that people were more inclined to think that the entity was capable of having experience when it looked like that than when it looked like that, even holding fixed all other factors. So I think we're starting to see at least some evidence for this particular hypothesis. And the hypothesis is a hypothesis about the cognitive process that leads you to think of human beings as having this special quality. The hypothesis is that that cognitive process involves these very superficial cues coming from the appearance of human beings. Now we can face this additional question, the question about warrant or justification. This is a more philosophical question, a question that goes beyond anything we could do just by doing empirical studies. So we began by saying that there's a very strong intuition we have about the nature of our world, about the nature of what human beings are really like. And this strong intuition says there's something really special about human beings, something that no kind of theory in neuroscience, in cognitive science, in robotics could ever capture. It's something that's a kind of special spark, a capacity human beings have that's mysterious or spooky in some way, that goes beyond the sciences. And it's a capacity in particular that we can never get when we're doing robotics or just building technology, because it's something that could never be achieved by a machine. What we're learning now is a fact about the underlying cognitive processes that give rise to that intuition, a fact about why people end up having that intuition in the case that they do. And the fact we're learning is that this intuition isn't driven just by these very philosophically respectable considerations involving the nature of human origins, the nature of the human brain, and so forth. Rather, these intuitions that we have are due in part to this much more superficial fact, just the fact that human beings look this way, whereas robots look that way. So once you learn this fact about yourself, I think you start to have reason to question the intuitions you have. Of course, you might think there are other reasons beyond your intuition, to hold on to this belief. But once you begin to understand the reason, the underlying cognitive process that's giving you the intuitions you do, you might begin to think maybe you should call into question those intuitions and perhaps even put them aside. Thank you.
It's really a pleasure to be here, and I was given some help tonight by the organizing committee. They gave us some questions to answer, so I've put these directly in the talk. The first is, how does my work inform my understanding of consciousness? My work focuses on building technology that helps people sense and communicate emotional information. Emotion is one of those things that in the early days when I started working on it, a theologian actually in Rod Brooks' zoo pulled me aside and said, Roz, isn't that the one thing that separates us from machines? And I spent a lot of time thinking about that, and no, I don't think it's the one thing that separates us from machines. I think there's a lot more than that. But as we learn about emotion, we learn a lot more about us and things that are understood and things that are still very mysterious. So I'll share a few hints of that with you. Let me give some examples. Our work spans things like wearable computers to technology that's in mirrors and reads physiology with regular webcams, and technology that goes into robots. In fact, we didn't coordinate on our talk, but you'll see some of the same images, so that's kind of cool, same wavelength there. One example is a sensor that reads out the sympathetic nervous system activation as skin conductance. And here it's being worn by a girl with autism on her ankles, and we see the signal from 2 ankles here going up, and you'll see her kind of having a little bit of a meltdown. She has difficulty verbally communicating her feelings. And what you'll see here is the signal will peak at the same time that outwardly she has a little bit of frustration and stress showing here. This blue window is the same as this little strip right here. Now, this technology enables us to disambiguate some of the feeling experience that a person has. Now, inadvertently, by wearing and working with this technology a lot, I have biofeedbacked on it over the years, and I've learned now what it feels like for my skin conductance to go up even when I'm not wearing a sensor. So I now know that one of these feelings that I've had my whole life is the feeling of my skin conductance going up. I also know that that's not the only feeling I have. I have other feelings that we don't know how to measure or explain. So this is just one of several. We're far from being able to truly measure and understand emotion. Here's another example of a very common emotion that we work on measurement of. You may recognize this one. Let me see if I can get the audio up here. Can you hear this? Can I have the sound up, please? Oh, wait, here, I don't have this plugged in. Helps if I plug it in. That was my fault.
I am sorry. You seem to be having difficulties getting through this form. Would you mind looking at the camera and share your thoughts on how to improve the form?
This one sucks.
You recognize the feeling. We do a lot of work with disabled people who have trouble expressing what frustrates them. We also do a lot of work with regular college students who usually don't have trouble communicating. Here's the guy in the same situation. But watch his facial expression. Eye crinkle and lip corner pull. All right, what you just saw there, he was frustrated too, right? But what you just saw there is what the theorists have said is the true smile of delight. All right? When we find things like this, it causes us to question, and this is one thing that as a scientist we learn to be humble about. What we've sometimes written about in my own work or whatever, we find out later was wrong. We find out later that this true smile that we thought was the genuine signal of delight actually is not always a signal of delight. So what we are doing is teaching computers how to interpret this information in context and to read its dynamics and to go much further. And indeed, the computers now are getting better than some people at recognizing the difference, say, we've shown this, between a smile of frustration and a smile of delight, because you can teach the computer to pay more attention to some of the dynamics that usually accompany the very jerky, fast smile of frustration versus the smoother, rounder, slower smile of delight. Our work also includes trying to understand pain. Pain is extremely complex, and we're really just scratching the surface on this. And this also includes some joint work with Cynthia Brazil, a close collaborator on the huggable robot, to give it the ability to also discern a person's pain. So this robot, in order to be a better healthcare worker, and I loved those questions at the start, would need to see if you were hurting, and it might read your facial expressions, it might read your sympathetic nervous system going up, it might see you pulling back in fear and anxiety at the sight of a needle or at the sight of a particular hospital worker. These are things that we're trying to understand in order to craft a better experience for people. Now, the next question is it possible to make a robot that has consciousness, right? That was one of the key things several people associated more with the human than the robot. And here you'll recognize this old clip of Cynthia Breazeal with Kismet. Oh, no. Does it tell you the error right there? Sorry about this. It worked before. I have to do a little computer surgery here. Where did that go? This isn't shrinking. Not responding. Sorry about that. Do you see Kismet? There we go. All right, and this has sound also.
So another important skill for a robot to be able to learn from people is being able to recognize communicative intent. Very good, Kismet. And the way we've done that with Kismet right now is to have the robot recognize by tone of voice. Yes. Are you praising it? Are you scolding it?
Where'd you put your body? No. No. You're not to do that. No.
People love it when the robot cowers at your reprimand, right? Contrast that with the Microsoft Office assistant Clippy, which you found online, strung up, in a noose and all. It didn't have emotional intelligence, right? It didn't know that it should look sorry when you were upset at it. Now, this is just a program, right? Kismet just has perception routines, decision-making routines, routines that say, in fact, I remember telling Cynthia, you really need to put a mouth on Kismet. Initially, it was all expression with the ears. We want to see and understand and infer some kind of affective state, even if what it has inside there is just a computer subroutine that really doesn't have anything like what we have inside. We want that because it helps us understand it and interact with it. So we're often willing to put up with a superficiality on the surface because it helps us have a better experience and it helps us get our work done. Let me give another example of this kind of thing going on. Let's see if this one will play. All right, and this one is out of UCSD.
It has the face of a boy, can smile, look sad, even angry.
Diego-san is part of a series to understand enough about how humans move and interact so that we can imagine building humanoid robots.
Robots learning not just how to express human emotions, but develop relationships with people. What may sound like the plot of a sci-fi movie is right now in the works at UCSD with Diego-san.
Now, when they start to take the robot and it looks less like Kismet and more like a humanoid, and believe me, the first time I walked in Japan, I saw these little child-sized robots with their vertebrae laying on a table like this. It starts to push those buttons that a normal human being has of feeling like there's something that you have in common with this, right? And so with that, you start to carry over more of your projections of what else it might have in common with you. Even with all of this illusion of them having feelings like us, though, and smiling when we smile and building up that reciprocity and making us feel like there's an empathetic rapport. And by the way, we work on giving them empathy, the appearance of empathy. It's quite important for working well with them. Nonetheless, they don't feel right or wrong. They may have a little program that sets the bit +1 or -1 if it gets it right or wrong, and you can attach things like that to other outcomes. But the experience of that is qualitatively different than anything we know, than anything we think we experience. They don't have the feelings, the experience, as Joshua pointed out, in people's minds. There's also no evidence to believe that hardware, software, quantum computing, biocomputing, anything on the foreseeable horizon is going to get us there. That does not mean that it won't, all right? It may be that it's possible, and we just don't know how to do it yet. All right, next, would a humanoid robot, if it had full consciousness, full experience, would it be human? I don't have to spend long on this thanks to your questionnaire up front. I think only 9 of you need to pay attention to my view on this next one, otherwise you have the same view. And I pulled out this example of my friend Hiroshi Ishiguro's robot Geminoid. He travels a lot and decided if he could send the Geminoid instead of him and just teleoperate it, right, then maybe, he doesn't have to worry about getting sick on the airplane and all that stuff. So he makes the robot that looks a lot like him. But it's still a robot. It's not a human, even if it gives the illusion of looking like a human and acting like a human, even if a human is jacking into it and driving it, and it sort of has a human consciousness up there in Japan, controlling it at a podium in Chicago. I work also with people in bioengineering who are engineering organs, livers, hearts, eventually brains. And some of them have said, we're just machines and it's just a matter of time before we can engineer a human completely, right? Not just a robot like Geminoid, but engineer a living flesh like us by assembling the pieces and growing them in the lab with the right scaffolding and all. This may also be possible. I think, though, as scientists, we need to ask not just what can we do, but what do we want to do? And when it comes to engineering a human that way, I ask, why do you want to make a human that way? There's a much more fun way to make a human, right? I have 3 sons. Now, but back to the hypothetical question, right? So suppose it could be done, right? Would this violate somehow that there's something special about us? Or as somebody who likes to understand things by building them, we think sometimes if we've built it, now we really understand it. Would having built a human in that way, engineering the tissue, mean that we had fully understood a human? And I think we might be tempted to think that, but we should be humble and honest not to think that. And the reason is this simple analogy to aliens building a radio. Aliens go to a distant planet, they discover these instructions to build a radio, they follow the instructions, it comes out looking like the radio in the picture, it has a knob, they turn the knob, and what happens? Music comes out. Wow, we understand how to make music, right? Isn't that tempting? If you've understood all the pieces of it, you think you've understood what it is producing. You think you've understood it. And yet, of course, we know about radio waves and things that they could completely miss, right? It may be possible that if we engineer a human, we're still completely missing something very important that might be there. So even if we can fully assemble a human someday, I don't think it's honest or safe to conclude that we have fully understood what it means to be a human. All right, and last I've been asked to talk about my worldview, and the Christian organization behind Veritas. My worldview, you might think of me as a traditional Christian, but actually I've probably been a lot of the different positions that are here in the room. My origins were growing up as a very proud atheist, underscore that, then sort of moving to being maybe a little bit agnostic, studying world religions, being challenged to read the Bible, finding it incredibly compelling, and then realizing as I was sort of starting to believe that I was hearing the word of God, that, whoa, maybe I'm just being persuaded by my culture, right? So since my culture was predominantly Judeo-Christian, I should go to visit mosques and temples and meet with people who came from lots of different world religions. So I did that. And even after all of that, and studying for quite some time, I came to the conclusion that I have now, which is that the evidence for Christianity, especially the historical evidence, the experiential evidence, the evidence from many people whose lives I've seen changed, as well as my own personal experiences. And this is an ongoing journey, but it has become quite compelling to me. So I am here as the Christian tonight to answer more questions on that as the night goes on. As I think about what we are and how my faith position informs that, I think not just about this biological stuff that we're made out of or the functions that we have, but also something more. And here it's not just physical stuff that we're trying to understand better, although one of my colleagues who's a staunch materialist and a roboticist thinks that there is probably something more than the material stuff. He's not sure what it is. And as he has tried to articulate what it is, he's come up with a nice technical phrase for it that I thought I'd share with you. He calls it the secret sauce. I've heard it also called the juice of life. Some people call it the living spirit. Some people call it some aspect of consciousness that's not just about the kinds of stuff we can measure. But I still think there's something more. And it comes from actually one of those late night conversations in grad school where my office mate and I were talking about how could our work be most meaningful. And he thought, he was real quiet and he's from Korea, and he just thought if I sit in my corner and I do great work, it will have great meaning. And I thought, well, most people are too busy to read your work. And if your work doesn't have great meaning to someone, okay, it may have, it won't have as great of meaning, right, as if it just sort of stays in your shell, as if it has meaning to someone. In other words, the greater meaning comes not just from the intrinsic value of the thing, but from the value accorded to it by another. And I think that holds especially for us. The fullest meaning arises in life when you experience the love and relationship of another. It's when somebody loves you or cares for you, they give you much greater meaning. They give your life greater meaning. And I believe that happens not just in this parent-child, or Cynthia, when they carted Kismet off to the museum, said she felt like she was losing her child, but also in a relationship as a Christian to God. Many of you might know Donald Knuth, who's considered one of the, well, some say the greatest computer scientist ever, computer science theorist. He's so revered at places like MIT that when he came to speak, not only was the auditorium packed and overflow and the fire people chasing people out of the hallways, but the newspaper headlines the next day said, "God talks about God." Don's a devout Christian, and he was talking about 3:16, his book of chapter 3, verse 16 from all the books of the Bible that had such a chapter and book. Why did Don pick 3:16? Many of you have seen this held up at ball games and stuff, right? This is kind of an unusual translation of it. Yes, this is how God loved the world. He gave his only child so that all people with faith in him can escape destruction and live a full life now and forever. And the acronym GOSPEL, which means good news, is spelled out. Fundamental to this is a relationship, a giver of a gift to us that gives us not just the life we have right now, but a fulfillment and an extension well beyond what I know I had before I changed from my atheism to my current viewpoint. Now, many of you have probably read the popular atheists lately, some of who, I think we need to question what they're saying. Some are saying things like Jesus was a myth. I don't know how they get away with saying stuff like that, because and I hope we would have better scholarship here at Yale. If you do the scholarship, do the history, there's plenty of history, and I'll just point you to one latest bestseller that attempts to walk through the historical evidence that points to this tremendous individual who's changed history here. And with Christian faith, we are invited to enter into a relationship with this individual, with Jesus, the Christ, the gift, who is here to show God's love for us, to give us that greater meaning. Now, what about other definitions of being human? I was at a dinner at that other school that starts with an H last night. I won't say the name. I was talking with a dean, high-ranking person there, who said, I think being human, she said she was a humanist, and I said, well, what do you think it means to be human? She said, self-awareness, critical thinking, consciousness. Well, I don't know about you, but anytime somebody makes a functional list, I think of some of the people I know. I think of some people I know who have a hard time demonstrating critical thinking. I think of how some of us sometimes, after maybe too much alcohol or whatever, have a hard time. But we're still human, right? In fact, I loved the to err is human definition there. Some people say it has to do with the shape of your body, our genes, that we have two legs. Well, my friends without legs, they're still human, right? What about self-awareness? Well, I was at an autism meeting where the top prize was going to a woman who said that autistic people were not self-aware. Well, I happened to be sitting there with a friend who couldn't talk when she was real young on the autism spectrum, but now she's an amazingly accomplished researcher. And she says, she goes, not self-aware. She goes, I guess I'm the only one sitting in a chair that's empty. All right, she was accused of not being self-aware. She was clearly self-aware. But many people like her who are accused of not being self-aware, and in some societies, more than marginalized. The ballast existence, the Third Reich ruling on disabled people, was they had no value as a human. That's a mistake with my worldview. We're all human, and we're all loved, and we all have the same value. So let me just wrap up. I ran an experiment a long time ago to go on a journey to allow that just maybe I was wrong about my atheism, just maybe there was something that transcended space and time, that transcended matter and mind, that just might exist and might be knowable by us. And in taking that journey, it has made all the difference in my life. I'm not necessarily a great moral person. Some of you who may be atheists may be more moral than me. I can't say I'm better than anybody. I can say that I'm much better than I was, and I still have a long way to go. But I can say that it has been an amazing journey, absolutely worth the experiment that was run. And I encourage you, as you think about what it means to be human and to have a fulfilling human life, that you also consider this particular view. Thank you very much.
So I enjoyed both of your talks very much, and I think one of the topics that you both brought up, which I think we may be able to talk about a little bit later on as we go through, is when thinking about this whole aspect of what it means to be human, the difference between people's perceptions of what it means to be human and how much that actually reflect or does not reflect what it does mean to be human. And actually, I couldn't help during both of your talks, as you were showing, some of the images of the low salience versus high salience, and as you were showing some of your robots, for some reason, RoboCop kept coming into my head. So, this whole idea that this person that we thought was a person is actually a robot. And I don't know if there'll be any room to discuss that, but just kind of feeds into some of these aspects about our perceptions and whether they're actually true or not. But before we get there, one thing that I want to ask both of you to expand on a little bit. So you talked a little bit about your fields of research and some of your findings. I was curious if you could expand for everybody how some of your own research actually informs us or helps us more clearly define what it does actually mean to be human.
I give it to you.
I think ours actually tends to make me think that we're much more complex than one starts off thinking. Like when I first started trying to model the human vision system, we thought it was mainly understanding the visual cortex. And as we dug a little deeper, not like literally shoveling in the brain, although some people are putting intracranial electrodes in, We learned that these deeper structures of the brain that don't even show up on a scalp EEG are contributing to, perception, fundamental perception. So in general, what we keep finding is each time we try to answer one thing, like how this little part works, we discover, or we raise 5 new questions and uncover more things. We keep seeming to find that we're more and more complex, which gives me even more awe and appreciation for how we're put together.
And I guess my own research informs the question as to what it means to be human, only in a more indirect sense. So the kind of work that we're doing has to do not directly with what it means to be human, but with how people understand what it means to be human. And I think as we get a better sense of the work that as this work sort of continues, we find more and more that people's ordinary understanding of what it is to be human is quite radically different from the kind of picture of what it is to be human that we see coming out of the sciences, which seems even ever more to sort of face us with a choice. That it's not as though we can see the scientific picture of humanity as in some way making more systematic or precise our sort of ordinary notion of humanity. Rather, they seem to be quite different from each other, so that we're, in many cases, sort of faced with a choice of whether we should believe the more scientific picture or whether we should believe more our ordinary intuitions.
Great. So to follow up on that a little bit, you also talked about this whole idea of the salience as well, and the perception that people have, and this also, not just the salience, but the experience versus the agency. Mm-hmm. So do you think there is a way that we can have robots, okay, getting back to this idea of robots, have more of that experience? Or is there a way that we can try and encode some of those experiences into the robotic development?
So encode the experiences of more, like make the robot more saliently human-like, or?
Yeah, so going back again to Josh's some of his research that he showed, that people perceive the robots as having less of an experience, but still having agency. So are there pieces that we can introduce into the robotic development that would make people's perception that they are more experienced? Yeah, so one thing you might notice, the Kismet and the UCSD robots that I showed, both were children. Kismet was, even though it looked mechanical, was deliberately given big eyes, big childlike eyes, because the hope was that if you match the expectations of the human interacting with the robot a little closer to what the robot's capable of, then we'll accord it a little bit more of that living nature, right? If we expected it to, I won't pick on Obama here, sometimes, like there's an Einstein head robot, and people are usually disappointed interacting with the Einstein head robot, right? There's a challenge in trying to match the capabilities to give that illusion of social interaction. And it is not just in appearance, but it's also in the timing and the reciprocity and the intelligence of the responses that it gives.
So my own view is that if you think about the way that our minds work, the way that we ordinarily understand the world, there's just something fundamental about the nature of our cognition that we're never going to see these robots as truly feeling emotions. As long as the robot appears to be robotic, as long as it just looks like a piece of metal, we're not going to think that it really feels anything. But even though we're not going to think that, a question arises as to whether we should trust that feeling. Are we right in not thinking that? So when we think about the robot, we're going to think there's something special that we have that it could never have. It's just a computer program, just a bunch of ones and zeros, and we have some further thing that goes beyond that. And the real question we have to ask ourselves is, do we actually have some further thing that goes beyond that? When we feel an emotion, do we have something within ourselves that's radically different from anything that could be in this robot? Or is what's going on in us something that, at least to a certain degree, is structurally similar to what we're finding, for example, in a robot? Of course, we don't have ones and zeros. We have activation within particular brain regions. But you might think that patterns of activation within particular brain regions, though different from what's going on in a robot in some sense, aren't different in precisely the sense that we'd have in mind here. That they don't constitute this kind of special sauce.
So to follow up on the special sauce analogy as well, I wanted to ask a little bit further, even though we've talked a lot about how it's difficult to actually define what human means and there's all these different components, how do each of you actually make an attempt to define what it means to be human? A light question.
We're just looking at each other. For me, there's the genetic, human from conception piece as one piece of it, living, and unique, and not just your genes, but the dynamic processes that surround them, the turning on and off, a lot more to us, right, than just our genes. There's also the relationship of us. We live in relationship to the world, to each other, and I think to the one who is the mind behind it all. And that is where I think we derive our greatest fulfillment of being human.
So what I study is not so much what it is to be human as how people understand what it is to be human. And as I said, a lot of work in this area seems to be converging on the idea that there are these two different elements of what it is to be human, or what it is to be perceived as human. This element of agency and an element of experience. And I think you can see these two elements coming alive when you think about what it is to dehumanize someone, to treat someone as not truly human. And as you begin to reflect on it, you begin to see there are really two different ways of dehumanizing someone, of treating someone as not fully human. To treat them as not capable of agency and to treat them as not capable of experience. So if you look at certain forms of racial prejudice, you see this kind of form of racial prejudice that involves animalizing people, treating them as though they're animals, treating them as though they just have a bunch of emotions, they're not capable of real reasoning or thinking or planning or self-control. And then you see another form of dehumanization that we might call mechanistic dehumanization, treating a human being as though that human being is just a mere machine or a computer, not capable of really having emotions, and hence not capable of experience. To truly treat someone as human is to recognize these two aspects of their humanity. The fact that they're capable of thinking, of reasoning, of self-control, but also the fact that they're capable of really feeling something, experiencing fear or love, or just even getting upset occasionally.
Can I ask?
Yes, go ahead.
So I see those as, frequently present. I agree with you about the dehumanizing. I've seen that a lot in autism too. But if a person lacks agency, I mean, they really do lack some ability to act. Let's say they're severely handicapped in that way for a while. Would you say they're not a person anymore? Okay. And same if they suddenly can't experience, if their emotion systems are defective, if they're consciously impaired, when they go unconscious or something, you wouldn't say they stop being a human.
No,
either, right?
What I'm saying is more that in our ordinary notion of what it is to be human, when we treat someone as sort of having full humanity, it's that we're sort of treating them as having both of these things.
Right.
The kind of people that you're thinking of, I think people often treat really poorly, that they do treat them in a dehumanizing way. It's because people aren't recognizing their full humanity.
But would you say those are sufficient for being human?
Oh, to have both of them is to be human. It's an interesting question. Of course, you could imagine some other species that has both of these things. What do you think about that question?
Well, we are building robots and agency that have some agency and that have some aspects of experience, right? But not just, substantially different from ours. So I think we could probably craft something that you could get people in the questionnaire. When you make it look a little bit more like a human, you can make those two bars look more similar, but I still don't think it's a human.
But I think that, I see what you're saying, but even though if we looked at the bars, they'd be sort of creeping up, I still feel there's some sense that people would always have, that I think you really articulated very well in your introductory remarks, this sense that even if we'd say to some degree that this robot is correctly described as having emotions, it lacks this special sauce. And then maybe we would disagree about how we should understand that fact about ourselves, the fact that we always have that intuition, but I think you're exactly right to say that we have it. That no matter how much the robot improved in its technology, we'd always feel like there was some special sauce lacking in it.
I think that's an interesting point, and you may have already addressed this question, but another thing that came to mind as both of you were talking was just the aspects of animals in general. So you talked a lot about the emotion and interacting with the robot, especially in some of the examples that Dr. Picard gave. And it actually made me think of the way that people interact with pets. So you do have some, emotive response from the pet, even the droopy ears and all that whole aspect. And then even personally as a researcher, when we do research in various animal models, I mean, you can give examples from rodents all the way up to primates, and you can see aspects of emotion in those pieces as well. So again, I'm curious to hear what you have to say about to what extent animals also have some of this agency and experience, and again, what's the step that differentiates humans from animals that may have some of these aspects as well?
You go first.
Well, I think the point that you make is exactly right, that when you separate these two aspects of our ability to understand things as having minds, you can see that human beings think of animals as having one of these aspects of mind without the other. So when we think about an animal, we think that the animal is capable of feeling pain, capable of feeling fear and so forth, truly capable of having experience. But at the same time, we think there's something that human beings are capable of that these animals aren't. Capable of self-control, careful reasoning, acting morally, and so forth. And so one way in which we can dehumanize certain people is actually precisely the opposite one of the one I mentioned of treating a human being like a robot. And I think that's what you see actually coming out when we think of people, especially in terms of their bodies. That when we think of a person in terms of their embodiment, there's one way in which we're doing something good, seeing them as being capable of these kinds of states that a robot could never have. But there's another way in which we're doing something really bad. We're thinking about the human being more as being something like an animal than as being something like a true, full-fledged human being. And it's for that reason that we're decreasing our attribution of agentic states to that human being. So just as you don't want to be treated as a robot, you don't want to be other people to treat you like an animal. It's only when the two things are put together to achieve our sort of full humanity that you are being treated in the way with a kind of respect and also with compassion that you would hope to be treated.
I'm thinking of this cartoon one of my students drew. And the first panel, Master shows up at the door at home at the end of the day, and his dog greets him with happy, waggy tail. I don't know how many of you have dogs. The dog looks really happy to see you. And the next panel, but the Master looks really unhappy, like he's had a really bad day. And the next panel, the dog is looking at Master with his ears back and his tail down and hunched over. And in the next panel, Master's noticing dog doing that. And dog mirroring him, like showing a kind of dog empathy. And in the next panel, they both look happy again. Now, that whole transaction, for those of you who have a dog, happens faster than it took me to explain it right there. And some would describe it as their dog knows their feelings and cares about them, and who knows, that may be possible. It also may be that the dog has just learned that he gets fed faster if he behaves this way. I hear different stories from cat owners. I've never had a cat. My mom hated cats. But I have seen people attribute elaborate feelings and cognitions to their pets. And I don't know how much of that is justified or is kind of inferred in a rigorous way versus wishful thinking. We have done some studies with some measurements in monkey brains and with the physiology we've measured, and we are seeing some things that are quite interesting and similar to some things we see in people. So I think it's a fascinating world to have an open mind about, and for those people who have pets they love, you're not alone. There's certainly a lot of really smart people who participate in assigning that intent to them.
So one last question before we open up to questions from the audience, but you guys have alluded to this special sauce. And so obviously it's difficult to scientifically quantitate or measure the special sauce. And even
tablespoon of special sauce.
Yeah. I guess you could measure it anyway. But even when we talk about the existence of God, so how do you think, from each of your perspectives, what's the best, or not even the best, but in your own experiences, way to evaluate that aspect of the special sauce and the existence, particularly of a creator, in terms of how we think about these questions that we've been talking about tonight?
You go first.
Well, I'm really interested to hear your opinions, but so to begin with, I just want to say that I feel the pull of this idea just as strongly as other people do. So when I look at my daughter, who's just 2.5 years old, and I see the way in which she's behaving, my heart goes out to her, and I could never, and I feel so strongly that she couldn't possibly be just a bunch of molecules, or that whatever she's doing couldn't ever be something that could just be understood by researchers in cognitive neuroscience. I feel so strongly that there's some kind of special magic going on here. But although I have that feeling, I'm not sure that I should trust that feeling that I have. I feel that thing very strongly, just as everyone else does, but I have a lack of faith in my own feeling, that I feel like as I begin to understand more and more what it is within my own mind that generates that feeling, the more I begin to understand it, the more I begin to feel that it's suspect, that this might be leading us astray, and that it might be the case that what's really happening in these cases is that these purely scientific theories are actually capturing the way human beings are, but that there's something about my own mind that will leave me with a kind of intuition, an immediate automatic reaction that will always reject what those scientific theories say.
I share that too. I'm going to take a different tack to this question. I'm going to kind of think out loud here for a minute. This is dangerous. So I build computers, software agents. I collaborate on building robots. If I were to build some robots that would be, like my children, like Cynthia felt toward Kismet going in the museum, and they were to say I'd go off to another planet and be autonomous and have agency and have a little bit of experience so they don't hurt themselves, right? You want them to experience something akin to pain and so forth so they don't get injured. I think I would want them to know that they were made by humans. I would think I might want to put something inside them so that even though they maybe didn't need to communicate with us, they might actually want to communicate with us. I think I might put inside them maybe some little program, and maybe we call it the SS program or something, that causes them to want to show, some more than acknowledgement toward what we did in bringing them into being. And why would I want that? I don't know, just part of the pleasure of making them, and in a sense we've kind of made them in our image, right? So there's an interesting role reversal here. And I think as we think of like why we have this in us, is this a feeling we can't trust, it's not real? Or maybe it's real, actually. Maybe there is something there. And just because we can't explain it with material stuff now doesn't mean that there isn't going to be a future explanation that is completely as satisfactory as our scientific material explanations now.
Great. Well, with that, I think we can open up the floor for questions. As I do a quick survey. Thank you so much. So we'll start with this one here. This is an intriguing one. So the question says, do you think that attempting to engineer a biologically functional or functioning human robot violates the sacredness of life?
Everybody's looking at me. I assume you think life is sacred too. No, I don't. I think it's a great way of getting to know something about us. I don't think we're anywhere close to perfectly engineering humans. Most of the work to engineer parts of humans is motivated by helping repair cancerous organs and defective organs and so forth. I also think that we are just really working hard to know more about how we are known. And it's not in denial of this greater truth that we are known by one. If anything, it's more sort of the sincerest form of flattery, of a kind of imitation, a wanting to know and a wanting to know the amazing maker of us.
I could very much see that there are certain real ethical problems that arise when we engage in this kind of behavior. But just as Dr. Picard suggests, I don't think that this particular one is the one that we should be worrying about.
So here's a question that deals with an aspect that comes up in neuroscience a lot, and the way that neuroscience is unique because it's the brain studying the brain, in the sense that we're thinking about how the brain interacts with the world, but we're using our brain to do that. So this question asks, if everything in our brains is the function of explainable, superficial processes, how can we use those same untrustworthy processes to question those intuitions? So there's an underlying commentary there as well, clearly.
With humility, knowing that we're sometimes wrong, sometimes defective. I'm going to sit here and just think about thinking for a little while.
I agree that it seems deeply, deeply puzzling to imagine that something that was able to question its own existence would turn out to be just a bunch of neurons. But although that seems deeply puzzling when you think in a way that goes just from the lowest level, from the level of individual neurons, say, to the highest level of, say, human cognition, as you understand each level separately, in the work that, for example, kind of work that, for example, you're doing, each level sort of begins to make sense, that you can understand how actual thinking could be the result of certain patterns of activation across whole brain regions, how the activation within each brain region could be understood in terms of individual neurons within that brain region, how those individual neurons could be understood in terms of molecules, so that continuing from the highest level to the lowest level, it starts to become less paradoxical to imagine a bunch of molecules could actually allow us to be having the very conversation we're having now.
So here's a question that's more on the philosophical side of things. So it asks, is being a person different than being a human, and how?
That's interesting. Some people accord personhood, a higher status, right? Like human is more just the flesh and bones, and personhood is something we show more respect for. I think it's a semantics question. Tonight, when I've been using human, I've been thinking of people, of persons. I do know that many of the people I know, some whom I love and am good friends with, are not viewed by other people as people because of their lack of abilities. I think of them both as fully human and as people.
Well, it seems like there's this important distinction between our particular species and this much more generally philosophically important notion of personhood. And just as you suggest, it could be very difficult to understand the relationship between the two.
So this next question asks, can robots be coded or taught to love?
Can they be what?
Can they be taught to love?
Taught to love. Oh, gosh. We got to keep this rated G, right? This is because they build technology for everything. It's interesting, as you study emotion, there is one that's noticeably missing from pretty much every major emotion theory, except maybe Manfred Klein's, and that's love. Love is not a basic emotion. It's not in the theories. And it's quite intriguing why it's not there, and it's really understudied. As we think of what it breaks down into, like listening and showing respect and showing caring and maybe putting another before yourself and maybe offering sacrifice of one for another, those things are things people are trying to start to program into a robot. So I do think at some point, someday, people may say that their robot loves them back like they love it, much like their dog does. Can they do that today? Not yet. But will they be able to fool people into thinking that? There will be behaviors that will give rise to that. Will it be true love the way we feel it? It will be substantially different, I think.
Wait, I'm just curious about why you think that. So what do you think is going on in us that we could never have going on in a robot?
Well, the difference of our experience with theirs, I think, has many facets. Perhaps the most obvious one is the biochemistry. And the robot biochemistry, right, is quite different. At least for the foreseeable future, it's more likely to be a computer program that says, gee, if you see this person smile, smile back. If you see them in need, offer to help. Here's ways that indicate need. Here's ways that might be appropriate to help. There will be perception reaction type programs that are crafted, hopefully, to appear loving. But I should say, too, it won't be the robot coming up with that, right? It will be the maker of the robot that is choosing to give the robot that kind of quality. And mind you, probably choosing to give it maybe to domestic robots and not choosing to give it to soldier robots.
Could I just follow up with just briefly on that? So I wonder, you mentioned two different things, which both struck me as really interesting. One was the biochemistry, and the other was the fact that it's created, say, by an engineer. So the issue of, I wonder which one, maybe they're both relevant or one more than the other. Suppose that as we continued working on robots, we decided this idea of making them out of silicon chips is not such a good idea. We're going to make carbon-based robots. And then we suppose that the actual chemical structure of the things we were creating started to look more and more like humans. Would that start to make a difference? So say that Kismet was made out of something. If we looked inside Kismet, it wouldn't be something silicon anymore. It would be something using the very same kind of chemicals that appear in our own brain. Would that make you think maybe it's more capable of love?
So this goes back to where I was trying to go with my extreme of if we bioengineered a human, right, with tissue engineering and so forth and all the chemistry. It kind of reminds me of when they tried to do an experiment in China to see if men could have babies. And And basically, to help a man have a baby, they had to basically convert him into a woman with all this hormone therapy and surgery and all this stuff, right? So at some point, you're basically trying to turn one thing into another thing in order for it to be there. And that's why I ask, why take that path, right, when there's another path? At some point, if you've just cloned another human being, you've cloned another human being.
So I think we'll do just a couple more questions before we move into the next piece of our evening here. But one question I wanted to get to was the question here. So it says, if relationship with God makes us more human, what does that say about humanity for people who don't believe in a God per se? So specifically here, referring to atheists.
Keep looking at me.
He's too close. It's just easier.
Well, I think God loves all people. Atheists, believers, unbelievers, all people. And the question is, do you accept that love or not? And, it's a free gift, right? You can choose to accept it. You can choose to not accept it. You can choose to pretend it wasn't even offered. But it is offered. And it's historically well documented. It's very clearly offered. So I think it's just an exertion of one's freedom if one chooses to not take that, right? And I think one of the things that's kind of interesting, and this is a dilemma we face too in making robots, do we want to make them so free that they could obliterate the word human from all historical robot memories and say that we never existed? Would that be true robot freedom? Would we want to make that?
So again, my work isn't so much on what people are really like, but how people perceive other human beings. There's been a lot of really interesting work on this very question. So how do people perceive atheists? And the answer is a really striking one. It's not that people have a prejudice against atheists, that atheists are insufficiently loving, that atheists don't have the right emotions, but there is a really strong prejudice against atheists. And that prejudice is specifically that atheists are not trustworthy. That is to say, people have a prejudice that they think if someone doesn't believe in God, this person is not going to be someone who will fulfill his or her promises, who will treat us correctly, and so forth. And it seems to be fundamentally a fear of dealing with people who don't see that some divine figure that can exert retribution against them. So maybe people don't think of atheists as lacking in humanity, but lacking in precisely that predictability that we think is most uncharacteristic of humans.
So you say underneath that, and again from your research, that there's an understanding that a perception of a higher being is, from a perception of a higher being is critical to how people interact. Is that kind of underlying, do you think, the results that you're finding?
Well, so this is not my own research, but that of our Neuron Zion and colleagues. But what they seem to be finding is that religion is a really essential part of our ability to interact with each other. And the reason why it's so important is because it's so important in our ability to trust one another, to believe that each other will do what we promise to do, not cheat, and so forth. It seems to be that even if you look at developing nations, those in which people are more religious, those nations show a greater ability to kind of interact with each other in an atmosphere of mutual trust and really achieve things they couldn't have achieved otherwise.
So one last question. Let's see what we can do here. So someone asked a question about, again, the low salience versus high salience, and whether that is expandable to different cultures or influenced by culture.
It's a good question. We've only tried it. It's an excellent question. Whoever did that should, whoever suggested that, we should try to figure out a way to do an experiment on this very topic. Some of the effects that I've investigated earlier have turned out to hold cross-culturally, so the very same effect is arising in many different cultures, and others have not. One thing we can say about this effect that's surprising is that it's unaffected not by culture, but by gender. So initially it might be supposed that there's something special, for example, about the way that men look at women, such that men's perception of women is affected by the degree to which they're showing skin in a way that would be very distinct from either of the other possible pairs. But in fact, no such effect holds. The exact same effect we see in men looking at women also holds in men looking at men, or at women looking at women, or women looking at men. But the fact that it's holding within our culture for all four possible pairs of genders doesn't at all indicate that it would hold across cultures. And perhaps it actually wouldn't.
So any closing comments that either of you would like to make on this whole topic of what it means to be human before we move to our next phase? You can start this time.
I just want to give a big thank you to you for all the really helpful questions that you just posed to us.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I also just want to thank everybody for really great questions, and I hope you'll continue the discussion. I hear there's some conversations afterwards with food.
So do we have instructions about exactly where
don't ask for yet?
where that would be?
The ultimate way to tell humans from robots is their desire for food.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.